The Intergalactic Military Academy on Station Nexus 7 operated on a delightfully simple principle. Big meant strong, strong meant capable, and capable meant survival. It was a philosophy so beautifully straightforward that even the most cerebrally challenged Gortak could grasp it while simultaneously bench-pressing a small moon. The Academy's recruitment officers had spent millennia perfecting this system, carefully selecting only the most physically imposing specimens from across the galaxy's warrior cultures, which made the presence of one particular Terran cadet something of a cosmic joke. The station itself was a marvel of engineering that could house beings ranging from the crystalline Zephyrians who stood 3 meters tall to the armored Bruckans whose shoulder width exceeded most species' total height. The corridors had been designed with adjustable dimensions, the gravity fields were modular, and the cafeteria served everything from liquid methane to compressed dark matter. Yet somehow, none of these accommodations seemed quite prepared for Earth's contribution to the Academy. Commander Vexthal, a seasoned Krillian whose scarred carapace told stories of 100 battles, had reviewed the Terran's admission file with what could generously be called bewilderment. According to the data, Earth was classified as a Class XII death world, a designation that should have produced warriors capable of wrestling supernovas into submission. The recruitment algorithms had flagged the planet as a priority source for elite soldiers. What they'd received instead was a creature that barely reached his thorax. The cadet in question stood exactly 1 meter and 63 centimeters in her standard issue boots, possessed the approximate muscle mass of a particularly fit galactic dove, and weighed roughly the same as a Zenthak's ceremonial sword. Her dark hair was pulled back in what the humans called a ponytail, a hairstyle that struck most species as either adorably quaint or tactically unsound, depending on their disposition toward decapitation. The other cadets had initially assumed she was someone's pet. Krog Ironjaw, whose name was both literal and legally binding after a childhood incident involving a mining accident and emergency surgery, represented the Bruckans with all the subtlety of a gravitational collapse. His species had evolved on worlds where the gravity could crush diamonds, and their idea of basic training involved juggling neutron star fragments. Standing next to the human cadet during morning formations, he looked like a mountain deciding to take up residence next to a particularly determined pebble. The Vex High delegation brought their own special brand of cheerful menace to the Academy. Razor-taloned, quick as quantum fluctuations, and possessed of an unfortunate tendency to view smaller species as either prey or practice, they moved through the corridors with the fluid grace of professional killers. Their representative, a sleek predator named Shakar the Bloodsong, had initially circled the human cadet with the interest of a gourmet contemplating an unusual appetizer. Then there were the Zenthak nobles, who brought centuries of selective breeding for size, strength, and an insufferable sense of superiority to every interaction. Prince Veltar, heir to 17 conquered systems, stood 2.5 meters of perfectly sculpted arrogance wrapped in ceremonial armor that cost more than most planets' annual budgets. His species had dominated the galactic political scene for so long that they'd forgotten what defeat tasted like, a memory gap they seemed determined to maintain. The Academy's training philosophy was refreshingly direct. Throw cadets into increasingly lethal situations until only the strongest remained. It was Darwin's theory with better special effects and significantly more explosions. The mortality rate hovered around 30%, which the instructors considered acceptably conservative. After all, real warfare didn't offer participation trophies or grief counseling. Most species adapted to this reality with admirable efficiency. The strong dominated, the weak submitted or died, and the natural order asserted itself with all the subtlety of a collapsing star. It was a system that had produced some of the galaxy's finest warriors, most notorious warlords, and a surprising number of very successful therapists. The human cadet, however, seemed to have missed the memo about natural selection. Instructor Bloodaxe, whose name was professionally required rather than personally chosen, watched her navigate the Academy's social hierarchy with the same fascination typically reserved for watching physics laws spontaneously combust. She didn't dominate through size or intimidation. She didn't submit to stronger cadets or seek protection from the faculty. Instead, she did something far more disturbing. She observed. Those dark eyes tracked movement patterns, cataloged behavioral quirks, and recorded tactical information with the methodical precision of a military database. While other cadets were busy establishing dominance through the traditional methods of chest beating and casual violence, she was apparently conducting some form of sociological research project. It was, frankly, unnerving. The first real test came during what the Academy euphemistically called Integration Week, a period when new cadets learned their place in the food chain through a combination of formal hazing and informal attempted homicide. The tradition served multiple purposes. It eliminated the genuinely unfit, established clear hierarchies, and provided entertainment for the upperclassmen who had survived their own integration. The human cadet's turn came on a Tuesday, which seemed somehow appropriate for what would later be remembered as either the most anticlimactic or most educational beatdown in Academy history. 3 Vexi had cornered her in one of the station's maintenance corridors, a location chosen for its convenient lack of security cameras and abundance of sharp surfaces. The leader, a particularly enthusiastic specimen named Crick's Shadowstep, approached with the confident swagger of a predator who'd never encountered anything that could effectively fight back below his weight class. "Little soft skin," he purred, extending claws that could punch through starship hulls. "You seem lost. These corridors can be dangerous for small prey." The human cadet looked up from the technical manual she'd been reading, something about reactor maintenance that seemed remarkably unrelated to immediate survival concerns. Her expression was the sort of mild curiosity typically reserved for discovering new species of particularly interesting bacteria. "Actually," she said, and her voice carried the kind of calm that should have triggered every predator instinct the Vexi possessed, "I'm exactly where I need to be." Crick's companions spread out in a classic hunting formation, blocking potential escape routes with the practiced efficiency of apex predators. It was textbook pack behavior, executed with the sort of lethal grace that had made the Vexi legends throughout the Outer Rim. They moved like liquid death, and they knew it. "You know," the human continued, still seated against the bulkhead, "your species has fascinating muscle fiber density. The way you distribute weight during movement suggests incredible burst speed, but I'm curious about your endurance capabilities." This was not typical prey behavior. Crick's hesitated, claws still extended but somehow less certain of their purpose. In his experience, cornered victims either cowered in terror or made desperate attempts at escape. They didn't conduct impromptu biology lectures while sitting casually on the floor. "Are you trying to distract us?" he snarled, though the question came out more puzzled than threatening. "Oh? No," she replied, closing the manual and setting it carefully aside. "I'm just curious about something. Your homeworld has 1.7 times standard gravity, right? And your primary prey animals are fast but relatively fragile." The Vexi exchanged glances that would have been comical if they weren't attached to beings capable of dismembering small spacecraft with their bare claws. This wasn't going according to script. "Your point?" Crick's demanded. She stood up with the unhurried movement of someone who had all the time in the galaxy. "Well, it means you've evolved as ambush predators. Quick, decisive kills against targets that can't fight back effectively. But what happens when your prey doesn't run?" The question hung in the air like an unexploded photon torpedo. Then she smiled. It wasn't a pleasant expression. It wasn't the sort of smile that suggested friendship, submission, or any of the other social signals the Vexi had learned to interpret. It was the smile of someone who'd just solved a particularly interesting puzzle, and the solution involved a significant amount of violence. "Let me show you what a persistence predator looks like," she said. What followed could barely be called a fight. It was more like a physics demonstration with surprisingly educational value. The first Vexi lunged with a speed that had made his species famous throughout the galaxy. His claws traced elegant arcs through the air, following attack patterns honed by millions of years of evolution and hundreds of hours of combat training. It was a perfect strike, delivered with lethal precision at exactly the right moment. He hit nothing but air. The human hadn't dodged in any way that made sense according to standard combat doctrine. She hadn't leaped aside or dropped to the ground or performed any of the desperate evasive maneuvers typical of prey species. Instead, she'd simply taken one step to the left while simultaneously rotating her torso, creating a gap exactly where his claws would have been while positioning herself inside his extended reach. Before he could recover his balance, her elbow connected with his throat in a strike that carried all the devastating force of proper leverage and absolutely zero wasted motion. He dropped like a meteor with navigation problems. The second attacker learned from his companion's mistake and adjusted his approach accordingly. Rather than committing to a single devastating strike, he opted for a series of quick slashes designed to overwhelm her defenses through sheer volume of attacks. It was a sound tactical decision that failed to account for one crucial factor. Humans didn't have defenses in the traditional sense. They had something far more dangerous: pattern recognition and adaptive behavior. She read his attack sequence like a technical manual, identified the optimal counterresponse, and implemented it with the methodical precision of someone following a recipe. His claws whistled through empty space, while honey introduced itself to his solar plexus with sufficient force to rearrange his understanding of basic anatomy. The third Vexi, displaying the sort of tactical intelligence that had kept his species alive for millennia, decided that discretion was indeed the better part of not getting turned into educational materials. He began backing toward the corridor exit with the hasty retreat of someone who'd just witnessed the laws of physics filing complaint with the galactic authorities. "Interesting," the human said, apparently addressing her unconscious attackers. "Your reaction time is impressive, but your recovery protocols need work. Too much reliance on overwhelming initial force, not enough adaptation when the primary attack fails." She picked up her technical manual and resumed reading as if nothing had happened. The third Vexi completed his tactical withdrawal at approximately the speed of light. Word spread through the academy with a sort of efficiency typically reserved for wildfire, plague outbreaks, and really good gossip. The story improved with each retelling, acquiring additional details about the human's mysterious combat techniques, her possible psychic abilities, and her apparent immunity to the laws governing prey-predator relationships. By the time the tale reached the upperclassmen, she'd reportedly defeated 7 Vexi simultaneously while reciting technical specifications for fusion reactors. The Krillian cadets were convinced she possessed some form of dimensional manipulation technology. The Zenthak nobles began theorizing about secret Earth military enhancement programs. The truth, of course, was far more disturbing. She was exactly what she appeared to be. Commander Vexthal called an emergency meeting of the instructional staff to address what he termed the Terran situation. The conference room filled with some of the galaxy's most experienced military minds, each trying to process the implications of a predator that didn't look like a predator. "Perhaps," suggested Instructor Gorklo, "we should reconsider Earth's classification. Maybe the Death World designation is some kind of administrative error." "Negative," growled Bloodaxe, consulting his datapad. "I've reviewed the planetary assessment. Surface gravity slightly below galactic standard. Atmospheric composition benign. No significant predatory megafauna. Relatively stable climate. By all measurable criteria, it's exactly the sort of soft world that should produce soft warriors." Then explain the corridor incident. "I can't. According to every tactical analysis model we have, what she did should have been impossible. A creature her size cannot generate sufficient force to incapacitate a Vexi warrior." Commander Vexthal's mandibles clicked in frustration. "Run the combat simulation again." The holographic display activated, showing a recreation of the fight based on security footage and witness testimony. The assembled instructors watched their expectations crumble as the tiny humans systematically dismantled opponents who should have been able to kill her without breaking stride. There, Bloodaxe pointed to a specific moment in the recording. "Watch her positioning. She's not trying to overpower them. She's using their own momentum against them, redirecting force rather than opposing it directly." "That's impossible," Gorklo insisted. "Prey species don't think tactically during life or death situations. They panic, they flee, they freeze. They don't conduct physics experiments." "Maybe," Vexthal said slowly, "we've been making incorrect assumptions about what constitutes a prey species." The implications of this observation created an uncomfortable silence that lasted approximately 17 seconds, long enough for several instructors to reconsider their career choices. Meanwhile, the human cadet continued her education with the same methodical approach she brought to everything else. She attended lectures on battlefield tactics, excelled in theoretical combat scenarios, and demonstrated an unsettling talent for identifying weaknesses in apparently impenetrable defense systems. Her academic performance was exemplary by any standard. Her social integration was proceeding less smoothly. The problem wasn't hostility from other cadets, quite the opposite. After word of the corridor incident spread, she'd found herself surrounded by a sort of protective bubble of respectful terror. Conversations stopped when she entered a room. Training partners requested transfers to different exercise groups. Even the dining hall seemed to quiet when she walked past the serving stations. It was, she reflected while reviewing star charts in the academy library, probably the loneliest form of celebrity imaginable. The situation reached critical mass during advanced combat scenarios, a course designed to simulate real warfare conditions through a combination of live-fire exercises and psychological pressure that would have impressed professional torturers. The Academy's philosophy held that cadets who couldn't handle stress under controlled conditions would be worse than useless in actual combat. The exercise began simply enough. Mixed species teams were assigned to capture and hold strategic positions against opposing forces using whatever tactics they deemed appropriate. Victory conditions were straightforward. Control the objective for 24 hours without losing more than 30% of your unit strength. The human cadet found herself assigned to Alpha Team, a mixed unit that included 2 Bruckens, a Zenthak Noble, 3 Krillians, and a Nova's Galactic Union representative who'd probably never seen actual combat. It was a reasonably balanced force with good representation from the galaxy's major military powers. Unfortunately, they'd been assigned to face Omega Team. Omega Team consisted entirely of Vex High Hunters, supported by Gortak shock troops and led by Prince Veltar himself. It was the sort of opposition that typically resolved training exercises in record time through the simple expedient of killing everyone who opposed them. The instructors had clearly decided that the human needed to learn her limitations. Team Alpha gathered in their designated staging area to plan their defense. The objective was a communications relay station built into a simulated asteroid field, a position that offered excellent defensive advantages if properly utilized, or a perfect kill zone if approached incorrectly. "We're dead," announced Krog Ironjaw with the cheerful fatalism of someone whose species considered death in battle a form of performance art. Omega Team has twice our numbers and 3 times our combat experience. The mathematical probability of victory approaches 0. The Vex High will use hit-and-run tactics, added Subcommander Thex UI, the team's senior Krillian. They'll probe our defenses, identify weaknesses, then coordinate a decisive strike. Standard pack behavior. Prince Veltar's reputation preceded him like a gravitational field. He'd earned his rank through personal combat against some of the galaxy's most dangerous opponents, and his tactical record was flawless. Facing him in a fair fight would be challenging enough for an experienced unit. This wouldn't be a fair fight. The human cadet listened to her teammates' analysis with the same focused attention she brought to technical manuals. When they finished cataloging their disadvantages, she asked a single question. "How long do we have to prepare?" 6 hours until the exercise begins, Thex UI replied. "Standard preparation time." "That should be sufficient," she said, and began sketching diagrams on her datapad. What followed was 6 hours of the most intensive engineering project the Academy had ever witnessed. The human cadet transformed from a mild-mannered student into something resembling a fusion of military strategist, physics professor, and barely controlled creative violence. She directed her teammates with the precision of a surgical strike, turning their assigned defensive position into something that would have impressed the galaxy's finest military architects. She'd identified 17 structural weaknesses in the communication station, mapped 12 potential approach routes, and calculated optimal firing positions for maximizing defensive crossfire. More disturbing, she'd somehow convinced her teammates to implement modifications that violated several laws of physics and at least 3 interstellar treaties regarding cruel and unusual punishment. "Are you certain this will work?" Krog asked, examining one of her improvised devices with the fascination of someone watching his own death being assembled. "Define work," she replied, making final adjustments to something that looked suspiciously like it belonged in a war crimes tribunal rather than a training exercise. "Will it help us win?" "Oh, absolutely. The question is whether anyone will be left alive to appreciate our victory." The exercise commenced at 0800 hours, Galactic Standard Time. Omega Team approached the objective with the confidence of apex predators who'd never encountered effective resistance. Prince Veltar had developed a straightforward plan: probe the defenses, identify the weakest point, then overwhelm it with concentrated firepower. It was a strategy that had served him well in 17 previous campaigns. It lasted approximately 4 minutes. The first indication that something had gone wrong came when the advanced scouts failed to report in. Vex High hunters didn't simply disappear. They were too skilled, too careful, and too experienced to make rookie mistakes. Prince Veltar ordered a tactical halt while he reassessed the situation. The second indication came when the communications relay station began broadcasting what sounded like a technical lecture on the theoretical applications of directed energy weapons in confined spaces. The voice was calm, educational, and belonged unmistakably to the human cadet. "You know," she said, as if addressing a classroom rather than a combat zone, "most military doctrines focus on overwhelming firepower as the primary means of achieving tactical objectives. It's an approach that works well when you have superior numbers or better equipment. But what happens when you don't?" Prince Veltar gestured for his remaining forces to spread out and approach from multiple vectors. If the humans wanted to give speeches, that was their prerogative. It would make targeting them easier. "The answer," the voice continued, "is that you have to think differently. Instead of trying to overpower your opponents, you create situations where their strengths become liabilities." The first trap activated when the Eastern Assault Team reached the station's outer perimeter. What had appeared to be solid ground revealed itself as a carefully camouflaged pit filled with enough electromagnetic interference to disable their equipment and sufficient gravitational distortion to make standing upright a significant challenge. The Western team made it 3 steps further before discovering that the human cadet had somehow reprogrammed the station's defensive systems to create localized weather patterns. They found themselves fighting through a combination of artificial lightning, directed magnetic fields, and what appeared to be weaponized atmospheric pressure. "Persistent predators," the voice explained helpfully, "don't rely on overwhelming their prey through superior strength. Instead, they use endurance, intelligence, and environmental advantages to gradually wear down opponents until victory becomes inevitable." Prince Veltar realized, with the growing horror of someone watching a masterpiece of tactical planning unfold, that he wasn't fighting a training exercise. He was being hunted. The remaining members of Omega Team regrouped at a safe distance to reassess their approach. They had superior numbers, better equipment, and decades of combined combat experience. They were facing a single human cadet and her collection of supposedly inferior teammates. They were losing. "This is impossible," snarled Shakar the Bloodsong, whose pack-hunting instincts were screaming warnings that made no evolutionary sense. "She's a single individual from a prey species. We should be able to overwhelm her through sheer numbers." "Maybe," Prince Veltar said slowly, studying the communication station through his tactical scope, "we've been thinking about this wrong. What if she's not prey?" The question hung in the air like an unexploded star. Then what is she? Before anyone could answer, the human cadet's voice resumed its educational broadcast. "Humans evolved on a world where survival required a different set of skills than most species develop. We couldn't outrun predators, couldn't overpower them, couldn't hide from them effectively. So we learned to think our way out of problems." A new series of traps activated, each one demonstrating a different principle of applied physics and creative violence. The Gortak shock troops found themselves caught in gravitational nets that turned their own momentum against them. The Vex High discovered that their stealth capabilities were useless against sensors that tracked body heat, electromagnetic signatures, and atmospheric displacement simultaneously. We became persistent predators because it was the only survival strategy available to us. We learned to track prey across continents, following them for days or weeks until they collapsed from exhaustion. We developed tools, tactics, and social coordination because individual strength wasn't sufficient. Prince Veltar watched his carefully planned assault disintegrate into chaos as his troops encountered defensive systems that seemed to violate everything he understood about military doctrine. Each position his forces took was anticipated, counted, and turned against them with methodical precision. But here's the interesting part. The voice continued, and there was something in its tone that made every surviving member of Omega Team simultaneously reconsider their career choices. Persistent predators don't just hunt prey. They protect their territory, their resources, and their pack members. When threatened, they don't run or hide. The final trap activated as the remaining attackers tried to withdraw to a safe distance. The entire asteroid field revealed itself as an interconnected maze of artificial gravitational wells, electromagnetic fields, and directed energy weapons that had been carefully positioned during the preparation phase. Prince Veltar realized he wasn't just losing a training exercise. He was receiving an education in the fundamental differences between predator species, and the tuition was being paid in tactical embarrassment. They eliminate threats, the human cadet concluded, and her voice carried the sort of calm finality typically associated with orbital bombardments and the heat death of the universe. The exercise officially ended 12 hours ahead of schedule when Omega Team survivors formally requested extraction from what the after-action report described as an educational experience in applied terror that may have violated several interstellar conventions regarding the humane treatment of military personnel. Alpha Team had achieved total victory while sustaining 0 casualties. The Academy's instructional staff found themselves facing a problem that didn't appear in any of their training manuals. They had developed an educational system designed to produce elite warriors through a process of competitive elimination, based on the fundamental principle that physical superiority determined military effectiveness. Then a tiny human had systematically demolished every assumption underlying their methodology. Commander Vexthal called another emergency staff meeting to address what he was beginning to think of as the Terran problem. The conference room filled with military instructors who looked like they were attending their own court-martial. Recommendations, he growled, his mandibles clicking with frustration. We could transfer her to advanced coursework, suggested Instructor Gorklaw. Skip the remaining basic training and move directly to Officer Candidate School. Based on what precedent? She's been here for 6 weeks. Based on the precedent that she's apparently been using our training exercises to conduct graduate-level research in applied military tactics, Bloodaxe replied, consulting his damage reports. Do you have any idea what she did to the communication station? She turned it into a weapons platform that technically qualifies as a violation of 17 different peace treaties. It was a training exercise. Tell that to Prince Veltar. His requesting psychological counseling and a transfer to a different academy, preferably one that doesn't admit humans. Commander Vexthal's mandibles clicked faster, which his staff had learned to recognize as the equivalent of human nervous laughter. What about the other cadets? How are they responding? That's a disturbing part, Gorklaw said. They are not afraid of her anymore. They are following her. The observation was accurate. In the weeks following the Advanced Combat Scenarios exercise, something fundamental had shifted in the Academy's social dynamics. The human cadet had somehow transitioned from isolated curiosity to the center of an entirely new power structure. It hadn't happened through intimidation or dominance displays. Instead, other cadets had begun approaching her with tactical questions, requesting her analysis of training scenarios, and seeking her input on strategic problems. She'd become a resource rather than a threat, and in military organizations, valuable resources naturally attracted protection. Krog Ironjaw had appointed himself her unofficial bodyguard, a position that mainly involved ensuring that her meal trays contained sufficient nutrition and that nobody interrupted her while she was reading. Subcommander Thex UI had begun deferring to her tactical recommendations during team exercises. Even some of the Zenthak nobles had started treating her with the sort of respectful attention typically reserved for superior officers. She had, without apparent effort or intention, become the apex predator she described in her educational broadcast. Not through physical dominance, but through the far more dangerous combination of intelligence, adaptability, and an apparently limitless capacity for creative problem-solving. The Academy's final examination took the form of a comprehensive war game involving all remaining cadets. The scenario was deliberately complex, competing factions fighting for control of a strategic star system, with victory conditions that required both tactical skill and strategic thinking. It was designed to test everything cadets had learned during their training, while providing a spectacular conclusion to their educational experience. The human cadet found herself assigned to the Blue Coalition, a mixed force of medium-sized species with decent equipment but no particular advantages. Their opponents included the Red Federation, dominated by Krillian heavy assault specialists, the Gold Consortium, led by Zenthak Tactical Brilliance, and the Black Legion, consisting entirely of Vex High Hunter-Killers. It should have been a reasonably balanced competition between 4 equal forces, with victory determined by superior tactics and leadership. Instead, it became a demonstration of why humans had managed to survive on a death world despite lacking any obvious physical advantages. The war game lasted 7 to 2 hours. At the end, the Blue Coalition controlled 87% of the strategic objectives, had eliminated 63% of opposing forces, and had achieved total tactical supremacy over an area roughly the size of a small solar system. More remarkably, they'd done it while sustaining minimal casualties and maintaining their supply lines, logistics networks, and civilian evacuation protocols. It wasn't just a military victory, it was a masterpiece of comprehensive strategic planning. The Human Cadets After-Action Report ran to 47 pages and included detailed analysis of enemy behavioral patterns, optimal resource allocation strategies, and recommendations for improving interspecies military cooperation. Her instructors read it with the growing realization that they weren't reviewing a student's work, they were examining a professional military assessment that could have been written by a general staff officer. The graduation ceremony took place in the Academy's main assembly hall, with representatives from across the galaxy attending to witness the conclusion of another training cycle. It was a formal occasion with ancient traditions, ceremonial weapons, and speeches about duty, honor, and the warrior spirit. The human cadet received her commission as a second lieutenant with the same calm attention she brought to everything else. She stood barely tall enough to see over the podium, looked like she could be overpowered by a particularly determined houseplant, and possessed a service record that would probably become legendary. Commander Vexthal presented her with the Academy's highest honor for tactical excellence, a decoration that had previously been awarded to such military luminaries as General Krath the Destroyer, Admiral Vengeance Incarnate, and Supreme War Marshal Death's Right Hand. She accepted it with a polite thank you and immediately began reading the technical specifications printed on the back. As the ceremony concluded and the newly commissioned officers began their assignments throughout the galaxy, Commander Vexthal found himself reflecting on the peculiar nature of Death World evolution. Earth had been classified as a Class XII Death World based on its capacity to produce dangerous organisms. The classification had been entirely accurate. The Academy's recruiters had simply misunderstood what form that danger would take. They'd expected a monster that looked like a monster, something with claws, fangs, armored hide, and an obvious capacity for violence. Instead, they'd received something far more dangerous, a predator that looked like prey, thought like a strategist, and approached warfare as an intellectual exercise in applied problem-solving. The human cadet departed Station Nexus 7 aboard a transport bound for a first assignment, carrying her diploma, her decorations, and a duffel bag containing technical manuals on 17 different subjects. She'd requested assignment to a frontier posting where her skills could be properly utilized, which the personnel office had interpreted as a diplomatic way of asking for challenging duty. They'd assigned her to the Galactic Rim, where a small colony was experiencing difficulties with raiders, supply shortages, and what the reports euphemistically described as local wildlife management issues. It seemed like exactly the sort of posting where a small, quiet officer could gain valuable experience without causing any significant problems. The irony, of course, was that the galaxy had just deployed its newest apex predator to a position where she could protect an entire colony of people who would probably never realize what was guarding them. And somewhere in the vast darkness between stars, a transport carried Earth's contribution to galactic security toward her destiny, a tiny figure reading technical manuals and quietly planning solutions to problems that didn't exist yet, but probably would soon enough. After all, persistence predators never stopped hunting.